So Wilson was not the progressive that many had hoped, and we kind of established this last week. He had World War I looming, and so he didn't really do as much domestically to help people out as what they'd hoped. And as a matter of fact, uh, really African American conditions and conditions for a lot of minority groups actually deteriorated under his leadership. For example, citizens with German backgrounds were really discouraged from cultural activities, and they were even discouraged from speaking in public. There were severe limits on immigration from Asians, and he really did support eugenics clearly. And those those beliefs in eugenics were somewhat responsible for his actions. However, under Wilson, we see that there were a couple pretty large amendments made. One of those being the 18th Amendment, and the other being the 19th Amendment. So the 18th Amendment we can see as being prohibition. Now, prohibition outlawed the sale and consumption of alcoholic beverages, and this was a great win for the women's temperance movement. In Kentucky, 1,000 distilleries closed, and that remained in effect until FDR initiated the overturn in 1933. But due to this, crime rate absolutely soared, and we tend to a lot of times think about this in the realm of, okay, it's illegal, it shouldn't be done. But whenever you look at, even in the state of Kentucky alone, with 1,000 distilleries closing, that's a lot of people who lost their jobs. It's not just the distilleries closing, the people who own the distilleries, it's all the people who work in there. It's all the people the farmers who raised the grain and everything else that goes into making that alcohol, that they lose their job and they have to find work somewhere. So crime rate absolutely soared once prohibition came in. And as a matter of fact, many who were big bosses in the crime area here were actually for prohibition because it helped them make more money. So though the criminal experience gained the political connections, and those political connections were established in gambling and prostitution rackets, and early in the 1900s, gangsters had well prepared for the exploitation of prohibition. There was a great demand for alcohol. It opened up new illegal markets for the gangster to develop and monopolize. And as Al Capone put it, all I do is supply a public demand. Somebody had to throw some liquor on that thirst. Why not me? So Capone had a brilliant criminal mind, and he focused in on organizing an international bootleg ring. He coordinated the importation of alcohol from different locations. Locations included other states, included Canada, and he had an operation of hundreds of breweries and distilleries, many of which were in Chicago. But Capone devised a system to distribute his alcohol, which involved delivery truck drivers. It involved salespeople's speakeasies. The speakeasies were equivalent to a bar. You had to have like a password to get in, and also heavily armed bodyguards to protect these investments. So, say, you had lost your job in from one of those distilleries. Now maybe you could pick up a job for someone like Capone driving those delivery trucks. Capone ended up buying illegal immunity by administering bribes to police and politicians, and he practically paid off every law enforcement agent and politician in the districts where he operated his illegal businesses. And those bribes, sometimes they were on the quarter of $1 million. They were relatively easy for Capone to dish out. He was earning over $100 million per year. So you need to bribe somebody? Yeah, it really wasn't a big deal for him. So he essentially took over the business of the nation's thousands of breweries and distilleries. And since he was more than willing to disobey the law, he had control over hundreds of professional criminals. He was, in effect, kind of when prohibition was put into place, he was handed a monopoly on alcohol production, and by that ratification of prohibition. So one of the things he did was called labor racketeering. Now that should be one of your words that's down here, racketeering. So labor racketeering, what this is it allowed the gangster to hide behind a legit business in a way. So it allows for cut of honest projects. So say he needs delivery drivers. One thing he can do is buy out maybe a milk company, because keep in mind, milk is going to be delivered at this point. And so you not only deliver milk, but you also deliver alcohol, and that hides behind a legit business. So it's a profitable and common business of the organized criminal. And so this type of crime involved the infiltration of gangsters into legitimate businesses. So the power of the gangs, though, enabled them to make and back up the violent threats. So say someone didn't want to sell their company or didn't want to give one of these gangsters a cut of it, they really had no choice because of the violent nature of it. So maybe they would say, for example, maybe they're not going to hurt that particular individual, but maybe they threaten to hurt their family or something to that effect. And so the next thing you know, they're able to run these businesses or this illegal operation through a legit business because this person does not want their family to be hurt. So anyone pretty much who's confronted by a gangster who wanted in on their business knew that they must do so in fear of being executed. Additionally, any opposition, including witness planning to testify against the gang's activities, was immediately killed by the gangster. So anyone who tried to put up a fight, pretty much bad things are going to happen to them. So you can read more about Capone in your book, and but another thing that came under Wilson was the 19th Amendment. And Wilson said that due to women's efforts that had been put forth during the Great War, there was no way he could deny them the franchise any longer. So the 19th Amendment is where women are allowed to vote in national elections. Many states, particularly in the West, actually had were already allowing women to vote in state and local elections, but the 19th Amendment allowed them to vote in national elections. So, and we talked about what women had done last week. I actually inserted this information in last week's lecture, so you could look at what women were doing, but due to their involvement in with Liberty Bonds and raising food and as nurses and with the YMCA and Red Cross and all those things, Wilson did feel like that they had to be offered the vote. So by the time we see the election of 1920 come up, this is the first election in which women can vote. And this was Warren Harding, who was a Republican, against James Cox, who was a Democrat. And Harding had advantages, but not necessarily because of his record. Primarily, Harding's main advantage was the decline of Wilson's popularity. So the Republican candidate did start seeming more appealing to the average person. So he was handsome. He looked like a president. Democrats actually feared that the newly enfranchised women would vote for him based on looks. And women did turn out for Harding, but it made very little difference because he would have won even without the women's vote. But what he promised was a return to normalcy. Now, this was not even a word at the time. But what he wanted to do was go back to the Gilded Age, away from progressive presidents, and back to kind of this laissez-faire type government where the government just kind of stayed out of things, and the everything would kind of equalize itself in a way. Harding's administration did anything but return the United States to normal. Um, it was his administration was established pretty much with unbridled corruption. For example, the Ohio Gang and the Teapot Dome scandal. So Harding filled his administration with cronies from Ohio, whether or not they had the qualification for the jobs. So kind of that return to the spoil system where you give favors and things like that. They line their pockets with money from corrupt business deals. And the Teapot Dome scandal is the biggest one. So Secretary of the Interior Albert B. Fall accepted bribes from oil companies to release U.S. oil reserves in Wyoming at very low prices. And this was called the Teapot Dome because there was a rock that was near Wyoming that had, or near those reserves in Wyoming, that had the appearance of a dome on a teapot. Newspapers, reporters, and cartoonists relentlessly attacked Harding and Fall, and became one of the most widely discussed government scandals in U.S. history. Fall was finally convicted of accepting bribes, and he was sent to prison, and Harding was devastated. Harding was actually advised to get out of town for a period of time, so he and his wife began an extended trip to the Northwest. So, four members of his cabinet were accused of public and illegal private money making endeavors. Harding possibly even had two mistresses. So while he was out traveling around with the advice of just kind of get out of here and remove yourself, he did have circulatory failure in San Francisco, which led to his death, which set Calvin Coolidge up to be to become president. Now, Coolidge was known as Silent Cal. He was a man of very few words. Typically, he had very yes or no responses. He actually sat next to a gal at a dinner party once, and she says, "I have a bet with my friend that I can make you say 3 words tonight." And his response was, "You lose." So, for those of you who didn't get that, it was only 2 words. She lost the bet. But he was elected on his own merits in the 1924 election. Despite being so quiet, Coolidge was known to be a very good man. He actually ding-dong ditched the White House while he lived there, but his son had a blister. They were playing tennis, and he got a blister. Now, keep in mind, there's not antibiotics at this time. And it became infected while Coolidge was in office and passed away. And due to that, a lot of people think that that's one of the reasons that Coolidge kind of drew back and did not further go on with the presidency. We will pick up with the Roaring Twenties on the next slide.